Hi everyone. Tonight's story begins with a quiet town, a string of missing pets, and a pattern that starts feeling far stranger than any ordinary predator. So settle in and keep your eyes on the screen. The summer of 2023 in the Florida coastal town of Bay Laurel was hot, and at first ordinary, until the local sheriff's office started receiving the same kind of reports. People came in with photos of their dogs and cats, showing collars and food bowls, repeating the same line. It just disappeared. House doors were still locked, windows intact, and in the yard there would be no tuft of fur, no blood, only flattened grass. Sheriff Wade Hollis, out of old habit, first blamed coyotes and alligators, though even he admitted the lack of any real traces looked strange. At first, the report said possible predator, but the more complaints piled up, the more cautious the wording became. One of the first real leads came from a couple on the edge of town. The husband had mounted a cheap security camera over the front entrance after a series of nighttime visits from something heavy on the porch. When their shepherd vanished from its chain, he reviewed the footage and brought the flash drive to the station. Late in the video, the yard was lit for a second by the headlights of a passing car, and in that instant, a huge shape seemed to dart across the patio on long, unnaturally thin legs. The image broke into digital blocks, but the outline looked too spider-like to pass for a cat or dog. The evening news aired the clip under the banner, "Mysterious Predator," and behind the anchor in the studio, two more similar videos from nearby neighborhoods flashed across the screen. Residents sat frozen in front of their televisions, and within hours, a new hashtag had appeared online, under which people posted every nighttime noise and shadow they could capture. Unlike the usual internet scares, these stories came with official case numbers and the names of the people filing them, and that gave them extra weight. Answering reporters, Sheriff Hollis insisted that the most likely explanation is a large predator, something like a cougar. But he himself had noticed one phrase that kept appearing in the reports: no signs of struggle. 2 weeks later, the local veterinary clinic was overwhelmed. People were bringing in animals with nearly identical wounds, clean circular openings on the side or leg, as though the skin had been pierced with a large needle and then sealed over again. Internal injuries looked far too severe compared with the small external marks, as if something had drained the animal and left behind an empty shell. Several dogs died on the way to the clinic, even though that same morning they had been running in the yard and playing with their owners. The veterinarians could only shrug and mention an unusual toxin or a rare parasite. But even inside the clinic, the word anomaly was being used more and more often. A patrol unit answering another late-night call found a chain of strange impressions in a backyard. In the dry sand by the pool were 8 deep dents arranged in an almost perfect circle, like the print of some monstrous animal that had planted all its digits at once. Between them ran a smeared line resembling the drag mark of a heavy hose being pulled over the ground. A deputy photographed the pattern on his phone, but the next morning, when he tried to show it to reporters, the image had come out blurred, as if the camera had focused on empty air. Another recording came from a construction supply yard, where a guard noticed a motion alarm and triggered the siren. On the footage, a shadow with many legs seemed to flow over a 10-foot metal fence, barely touching the crossbars. A moment later, it was already on the other side, while under the floodlight, there was only empty concrete. The guard insisted he had seen something like a giant spider, but company management strongly urged him not to feed the panic. When the number of reports passed 50, a team of biologists and zoologists arrived from the university in Gainesville. Officially, they had been invited to assess the risk posed by an unknown predator. Unofficially, local authorities wanted some kind of reasonable explanation before the county became the center of another conspiracy storm. On one farm, the specialists found what they had been looking for. On the roof of a shed, where the owner said something heavy had been climbing at night, there was a scrap of dense gray material. It looked neither like fur nor skin. It resembled fused, charred tendrils. Under the microscope in the lab, the fragment broke down into a complicated structure. Layers of chitin interwoven with something like fibrous muscle, along with fine, transparent threads resembling nerve endings. One of the biologists muttered that with that amount of mass, the animal should have collapsed under its own weight, unless the gravity it was built for had been different. The samples were sent for DNA analysis in expectation of finding a mixture of known species, perhaps some mutated spider or hybrid predator. The results arrived a few days later and only deepened the confusion. The computer identified fragments of genes from marine organisms, tropical arachnids, and whole blank sections that the program honestly labeled unknown sequences. At a closed meeting, one of the senior researchers cautiously offered a conclusion. It gives the impression of an organism built for different conditions, a colder environment, a different air density. When the team compared the findings with weather data, another coincidence appeared. Every reported sighting of the predator matched an area where night temperatures showed a small but steady deviation from the seasonal average. Taken together, it formed a picture no one wanted to state too directly. It felt as if a fragment of some other ecosystem had briefly overlapped the familiar climate of the town. A map built from resident reports, police data, and weather service readings showed that all the incidents fell within an oval patch covering several blocks on the north side of Bay Laurel. At night, that area was always slightly colder, and humidity stayed higher than in the rest of town, as if an invisible dome hung over the houses and lawns. In daylight, however, the differences almost vanished, and people there lived normally, except for occasional complaints about a strange draft behind closed windows. The area was filmed from above with thermal imaging. On the screen, it looked like a dimmer, darker blur, foreign against the steady heat of tropical air. After meetings with police and local officials, they decided to run a controlled experiment. Dozens of cameras were installed around the perimeter, standard, infrared, and thermal, along with portable pressure and humidity sensors. In the center of the zone, they placed a metal cage with a reinforced frame and a hatch built to withstand the impact of a large dog. Inside, they put a service dog, lightly sedated and protected along its sides with dense but flexible armor. The scientists' thinking was simple. If the predator was real, it would try to reach the animal and leave behind some kind of physical trace. The whole operation was given the academic name Observational Experiment under Conditions of Uncontrolled Anomaly. But the faces of the deputies and volunteers suggested very different emotions. As people stepped out of the yard, they kept glancing at rooftops, trees, and the dark windows of neighboring houses, as if expecting an eight-legged silhouette to appear there at any moment. By 10 o'clock, all observers were gathered in a van full of monitors, while outside the street looked calm and deserted. Only the instruments, quietly beeping with every change in temperature, reminded them that inside that invisible patch, different rules might be operating. Around midnight, the cameras caught the first shift. What looked like fog began rising from one side of the block, though the forecast had called for a clear night. The pale cloud crept slowly along the road without dispersing in the streetlights, and every dog within earshot suddenly began barking at once. The thermal imager showed that the temperature inside the patch dropped another 2 degrees, and around the bait cage the air seemed to grow denser, heavier. People inside the van exchanged looks. Someone automatically reached for the floodlight switch, but the team lead stopped the hand. They needed to wait until the object was in the center. A few minutes later, the infrared camera showed a shape that resisted simple geometry. At first, it looked like a blurred oval dome, as if a huge gelatinous bubble were dragging thin threads down toward the ground. Then 8 long supports took shape, wrapped in rough hide and touching the pavement only rarely and briefly, as though the creature did not need true contact with the surface. Where eyes should have been, the thermal camera showed a scatter of tiny hot points, dozens of glowing beads flickering like a cluster of candles. The creature moved almost silently, and the only sound was the dog's rapid breathing in the cage. When the arachnid-like form approached the bait, its outline suddenly sharpened, as if some invisible barrier had wavered. On the standard camera, it became visible that the dome-like body resembled the bell of a giant jellyfish, while the legs, covered in uneven growths, ended in thin claws. At the team lead's order, the floodlights came on. White beams slammed into the center of the yard, pulling out a hard pattern of long limbs and a gelatinous body from the dark. The creature jerked, as if burned by the light, and in the same second came a burst of gunfire. The bullets hit dirt and fence. The silhouette snapped sideways, leaving only a smeared stain on the frame. One of the long legs still struck the metal cage. The sound rang through the yard, and when the footage was reviewed, it showed a dark fragment of tissue tearing loose from a shattered segment. The creature seemed to launch upward not from the ground, but from the air itself, then vanished into the fog, which began to disperse as suddenly as it had appeared. The barking of dogs around the neighborhood cut off almost at the same time, and the temperature sensors slowly climbed back toward normal nighttime values. People in the van sat silent for another minute, hearing only their own breathing, until someone finally exhaled. "We were recording, right? Tell me all of that was recorded." The detached fragment of the leg was sent to a federal laboratory, where it was handled with the care given to major case evidence. During examination, the material resisted standard reagents. Acids and alkalis strong enough to break down ordinary chitin left only a dull trace on the surface. Under an electron microscope, the tissue looked like a weave of thick fibers and transparent strands through which tiny sparks occasionally ran, as if bits of signaling still lingered inside a cooling biological wire. The scientists noted that heat moved through the sample unevenly, as though it had been made to function in a different temperature range. In the final report, the scientific team stated the conclusion as cautiously as possible. The sample demonstrates characteristics of an organism adapted to an environment different from the region of its actual discovery. In private conversations, the line sounded much simpler. "It feels like it ended up here by accident, like it was built for somewhere else." A few laboratory staff privately discussed the possibility of a kind of window through which part of an unfamiliar ecosystem might have leaked, but no official reference to that idea remained in the paperwork. The folders were sealed for an indefinite period, and local residents were released from their non-disclosure agreements only with one condition: no mention of the operation's details. After the night of the hunt, the unusual patch over the northern part of Bay Laurel vanished as quietly as it had appeared. No new cases of missing pets were recorded, and the wind and heat returned to their usual numbers. Officially, county authorities stated that the panic was caused by a series of viral videos and distorted information about local wildlife, and all questions about laboratory testing were redirected to the phrase "restricted information." Residents gradually went back to their routines, but many never stopped locking their animals indoors at night and lighting their backyards with flood lamps. The meteorological engineer who had assisted the biology team quietly kept a copy of the thermal maps from the last night. A few months later, reviewing them at home, he noticed one detail he had missed in the rush. In the final minutes before the cold zone faded, the anomalous object was not circling houses or searching for prey. It was moving almost in a straight line toward the edge of town, then toward the highway, and seemingly toward the coast, leaving behind a narrow trail of slightly altered temperature. It looked less like flight from the floodlights than departure along a route it already knew. Several weeks later, A short news item in another state mentioned a strange giant spider at a gas station late at night, but the segment was quickly pulled and the footage vanished from public access. The engineer managed to save only a few still frames, and what struck him most was the familiar placement of the legs and the same blurred outline of the body, as if the camera itself could not fully understand what it was seeing. In his personal notebook, he drew a map of the United States and marked his town and the site of the new report with a red pen. Beneath it, he wrote only one line: "Not a local species. It only checked us," and moved on.